Howdy all of you delicious people, I'm here today to review Madman. So this was a movie that really I thought was great. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's one of those movies where you go on and you have the character who ends up reading the story and ends up becoming the story in real life. So the things that are in the book all of a sudden start to become more real than they should, because of course Virginia is to be going on into this story and and incorporating herself into it. And so at first we have a book called Much of Madness, More of Sin, and then we go on into the Madman book. So really I just went on and I was like, man, like there might be some goofy things about this movie, I will admit that, but like the overall just approach to the movie was just like, man, I love this kind of film. I enjoy this kind of approach. And so yeah, like definitely it was a great film. It was on Tubi, TUBI. I somehow figured out a way to have known that this movie existed, and then once I figured out what it was, I was like, oh my god, I need to see this. I need to know what it is. I need to have this be somehow a thing that I can possibly review, and hopefully I'll remember every bit and piece of it because like it was so good. So yeah, so this movie we go on to have Virginia, who it seems to be a bookworm to the point of her working at this used bookstore. So Virginia goes on to try and read through this story, this kind of horror book, and then she ends up becoming uneasy at certain points, needing Richard, her detective boyfriend, to come and see her so she can be comforted by him as she's going on reading this horror book. So the further and further Virginia is going into this book, all of a sudden, once she is to incorporate herself into this story in kind of a never ending story kind of approach, all of a sudden we have the Madman who ends up incorporating himself into Virginia's real life. Going on and having the Madman want to go on and reset the way he is to look so it could be more pleasing to his love, who he thinks is Anna, but is actually Virginia in this story. And so the Madman is to go on and take pieces from people's bodies and place it upon his own face, so that way he can look more attractive to Anna slash Virginia. But by the end of this story, it really does not come out that way. It doesn't come out like this guy looks like, wow, like what a drastic, more enticing looking character. But in the very beginning of this movie, we also have a child who we think is a child, but then is actually to be this like monsterish being, and ends up kind of coming into the fray and scaring the crap out of me because I was like, I wasn't expecting this. But like once I got past it, I was like, oh, okay, all right. Like there was like one other scene that scared me in this movie, but I knew it was coming. But I just felt like, man, like I knew that it was coming, but still it got me. I don't know why. Because I knew it was like, oh, this is probably gonna be a jump scare right here, and surefire enough. So, but I've never seen this movie before, so it was kind of some unexpected moments. It was like some good, like, yeah, something got me finally. Because very rarely do horror movies actually scare me, so it's great. So we, of course, we go on and also have the Madman that goes on and kills certain people that either Virginia knows or is to be consistently involved with in one way or another. Maybe not Richard, but of course, any number of people are to be game to go on and have uh, this Madman go on and go after people. I say Madman because it seems that in this IMDb, we have this character that is either called Dr. Kessler or Malcolm Brand, which is to actually be the author. Come to find out, there's a whole like interesting backstory for Malcolm Brand, the author, where it seems that he is to when he is to have been writing this story, all of a sudden it seems that the characters in his book were to have gone on and haunted him as well. So yeah, like leaving it to be that there is some like horrible backstory of the author who is to write this book, but then he is to eventually pull the plug on writing anything because he just uh, like couldn't handle it any longer. But then when Virginia ends up getting involved in this story, you could possibly understand why that is. So, with that said, this that one like me explaining this movie is possibly very vague, but at the end of the day, I would say go on and believe me, see this movie. It's so enjoyable. Maybe not the very beginning of it, but once you get past that opening sequence, like I think it really is like, okay, wow, like this is something interesting. But it may not appeal to everybody. You could go on and just be like, what garbage is this? And I'll just be like, well, I don't care. Like I enjoyed this movie. I did. I was just like, man, like this is so good. I just so was like, yeah. Um, but so, with that said, I think it's about that time to just go into spoilers. This movie is currently available on Tubi, TUBI. If you cannot or do not have Tubi available, hopefully there might be another app to, in fact, be able to watch this with. Uh, or go on to any new releases that, of course, I have gone on and mentioned through the time of which that I've gone to do this, and you'll see that there might be a plethora of different apps that may be more convenient for you to do and use and whatever. So with that said, let's just go into spoilers, because there's a lot for me to go on and state when we get into spoilers. Hopefully I'm going to figure out every single thing that ends up getting incorporated in this film, because there's a lot to just kind of go through, like little tiny parts that all add up into one full movie. So with that said, I think it's about that time to just go into spoilers. So let me know in the comments below if you went on to check out I Madman, if you enjoyed it, if you hated it. I like these kind of movies where you like fiction becomes life kind of thing. Like I've gone on to see like a number of movies that are kind of in a plethora of different kind of categories where you would go on and have a person play, I think it was like Brain Scan or something like that, where you'd have the kid who's thinking that he's just playing some normal video game, but then all of a sudden you realize that he's actually just being hypnotized and he's actually going on and killing people, and he thought it was a video game the whole entire time. That was great. Like I thought that was cool. And like I would go on and just have a number of movies that are just kind of like art imitating life kind of things, and so on and so forth. So like a never ending story kind of thing. So anyways, let's go on and let's double five, because I think it's about that time yet again to go into spoil time, about the time we get to spoil this movie. Let's go into it. So in the beginning of this film, we have Virginia, who is obviously reading a story. And so in the beginning of this, we have a hotel clerk named Lyle who is telling Dr. Kessler, like, have a good night as he's walking off. Dr. Kessler doesn't go on and say anything. He just kind of looks back like, yeah, all right. So all of a sudden, we have Lyle at the front desk getting a phone call from Dr. Kessler's neighbor stating that she is to hear these growling noises. And so Lyle is to talk to the hotel manager and is to state it's like, well, yeah, there must be some kind of growling noise coming from this apartment. And so the hotel manager is like, well, like, we have to check it out, because if this guy has animals in his place, then he is going to get kicked out of here. And so Lyle is to tell the hotel manager, it's like, well, we would go on and have like expressed instructions from Dr. Kessler to not go in his room no matter what. And so the hotel manager is like, well, like, I'm the manager, I'm going to go up there. So the hotel manager goes into this guy's room and is to see some unusual scientific work being done here, and is to also see these kind of like Chinese food uh, packages that, of course, are to have bugs in them. So we have this guy notice this kind of case, this large case that is to have holes in it and is to have crap right next to it also. So we have the hotel manager that is go on and just try to like hear what is going on inside this case with holes in it. And if there isn't like a little bit of noise going in there, we all of a sudden are to hear a possible like human sounding noise. So the hotel manager just kind of opens up this case, not thinking of what's really inside here. And then he ends up calling the head desk and saying, like, hey, call the police because something definitely wrong is going on here. And Dr. Kessler is misusing this child. So come to find out, this thing is not a child after all. It ends up being some monstrous thing that ends up making its way to pop up and scare the crap out of me because I was like, what? I wasn't expecting anything. So the monster ends up going on and killing the hotel manager, and then the neighbor next door, who looks like Virginia, is kind of hearing what's going on through the other door, and the monster ends up breaking through this door and attacking Virginia and killing her off. And we then all of a sudden have Virginia, who is to kind of finish reading this book, and so she kind of closes it. And so Virginia is now a little bit scared, and so she ends up calling Richard, stating that, well, hey, if you want to come over and you want to have a couple of beers, or you just kind of want to just be with me, that would be great, because Virginia, of course, is fairly scared. And so we have Virginia that goes on to kind of wait for Richard to possibly show up, and he does. We have Virginia that is going on and listening to this piano restorer that, of course, is to be nearby because there is to be a whole piano repair and restoration building next door, so she consistently listens to this piano. So Richard ends up dinging Virginia's apartment. So we go on to have Richard come up, and so Virginia is trying to clean up her place to make it look nice. She has some Chinese containers, that's what I was looking for, that she kind of puts aside. So Richard makes his way up there, and Virginia is to also try to hide her book, so Richard doesn't see what book she's reading, because he might have some choice words for this, because whatever book that Virginia is really into, Richard's kind of like, So, you know what I mean? Like, he's just not having it. He always has some goofy thing to state about whatever book she has. So the one place that Virginia tries to hide this book, Richard ends up sitting on it, and he ends up going on to take this book and starts reading it as Virginia is doing something in the other room. And then when Richard starts reading it, Virginia's like, oh, he found my book. So to try to get Richard to stop reading the book, Virginia just starts to lay on top of Richard, and Richard is like, well, why would you read a book like this? And Virginia's like, well, it's just a potato chip. Like, once you have one, you just can't stop. And so we have Virginia trying to explain to Richard why she's to like this book because it appeals to her. So we then go on and seem to have Richard and Virginia getting very romantic and very intimate, to the point of them going on and having a moment together, let's just say, to be a little bit more creative than trying to say what actually happens. And they, of course, are to listen to the piano in the background. So we go on to, of course, transition the very next day. We have Virginia that goes on to be talking to Mona. And so Virginia is mentioning how it seems that the relationship between her and Richard is really working out, that at some point she's going to go on and need to see his family or his parents, because that's, of course, what Richard at some point wants to progress this relationship. And so Mona's like, oh, okay, well, like, yeah, go on and definitely, like, do whatever you need to do to meet those parents and, like, progress this relationship, so on and so forth. Because, of course, Mona doesn't have anybody, to the point of her at some point mentioning how uh, she's probably better off to go on and find like a smart guy in a bookstore, or a used bookstore, which of course they're kind of selling off these books, rather than going out to a bar and meeting not so smart guys there. So Virginia is to have noticed that there is a secondary book beyond the one she's already reading, and so now she's trying to search throughout the bookstore to try and find it. It seems at some point, while Virginia is making her way through this bookstore, we have a guy who is to go on and look like the previous Dr. Kessler, who has made his way through this bookstore also. Virginia does not go on and see him, but then he ends up kind of just walking out. So, come to find out also, it says in IMDb that this guy is Dr. Kessler, but then is also Malcolm Brand. I'm going to go on, and when we get into the Madman book, I'm just going to go on and consistently call this guy Madman, because that makes the most sense to just call this character that character. So, even though he could be something else, either way. So, it's just easier to do that. So, Virginia goes on to look through this whole place, is to even look into this case that looks the exact same from the case from the opening part of this movie with the holes in it. So Virginia opens this case and is to have all these books kind of fall out, and so she's starting to clean up this thing. So it seems that they have to go on and figure out what to do with all these books for this estate sale. And every time we go on and have these characters kind of have rapport with one another, both Mona and Virginia, they're also talking about the estate sale and how they have to kind of go on and figure out how to clean out these books, because Mona is to state that like her boss is to be upset about it, so they gotta figure out how to clean all that mess up. But so Virginia could not go on and figure out where this book was. So we go on to have Mona after her day of work. We then turn around and have Virginia that goes off to this theater class, because I guess she's in some kind of theater class. So Virginia is to be watching on with this play with a woman named Colette and some male actor, and they are performing some scene, and Lenny ends up walking in late to realize that it's like, oh, it's Colette up there, like, and their scene is to go on and have this guy kind of push this pillow over Colette's head, making it look like he's trying to suffocate her, but then they end up kind of cutting the scene. And then the theater teacher is like, hey, do you guys have any comments about like what we saw just here? And everybody's like, no, that was great. And so we have the theater teacher that's like, okay, well, next one's up is so and so and so and so. And so Lenny then realizes that him and Victoria aren't going to go up there and do their act, which of course was to be the, oh my god, I probably had the name of this too. The guy with the very long nose, the guy who was to go on and do uh, the kind of the Romeo and Juliet kind of thing, and Steve Martin ended up doing like a movie about it, uh, where he has this like long nose and he's like a firefighter. Heaven forbid I remember what that was or figure it out. So let's move on. So we have Virginia that is to go on and go home and read more of Madman. So Virginia is to go on and portray this girl named Anna, and it seems we have this madman that goes on to showcase to Anna that he is to give up a portion of his face to at some point try and find new pieces to restore his face or reset his face to make him look more attractive. And so we have Anna who is to go on and just like, no, like I won't accept, no, and she is to just be in fear of her own husband. So all of a sudden, once Virginia stops reading that and is to all of a sudden find out that there's someone coming through her place, she then grabs this like fire poker, and we have Richard who comes into place, and so she almost like strikes him with this fire poker, and Richard's like, hey, you should really lock your door. So we have Richard who brings in pizza for them to have because he was to, of course, have a stakeout. So he ended up having to cancel plans with Virginia for them to go out and have something to eat. Uh, but he eventually comes to be with Virginia. And so we have Virginia that ends up asking Richard if he would ever go on and cut off his ear to appease Virginia. And Richard's like, what kind of a question is that? Why would anybody go on and do something like that for love? And so Virginia's like, well, I just read this story and it was about a guy who this woman like didn't like this guy's facial features, and so he just kind of cut them off, and he was going to try to figure out a way to like find a better part of his a better replacement to appease his wife, and so on and so Richard is just like, well, like, you know what, if it would make you happy, like when I go on and I'll shave tomorrow, like I'll cut myself shaving. Like, will that appease you? And Virginia's like, oh yeah, that's great. So after it seems that Virginia and Richard is to fall asleep, Virginia is to then turn this light on, and she, of course, is to go right back into reading I'm Madman. And so we have this story where we have this guy who's to be very poetic, this madman who is to go on and, like, to me, like, the scene with this actress, this kind of redhead, or this red, um, it seemed to me that this scene felt very much like the beginning, because I didn't see the whole movie. It seemed like the beginning of the Elijah Wood Maniac movie, and so I thought that was like, man, that feels like very similar. But so we have the madman that goes through and starts stalking this actress, this redheaded girl who ends up looking a lot like Colette. So we go on to have the madman who follows her to her place, and the further and further that this guy starts stalking a woman who looks a lot like Colette, or let's just say Colette, we have her go on to rush to her door and try to close it on this madman, and the madman ends up going on to pull this girl's hand and is to inject her with this needle that can put her to sleep. And so Colette, who is now starting to feel weak, is to like go on through her place and try to figure out if there's a way for her to go on and like get away from this killer. And the madman is to go on and say, it's like, okay, let's go on and let's count backwards from 100. So he starts counting backwards from 100 himself, and Colette is running through the place. She ends up trying to close this bathroom door, but I guess she can't lock it. So we have the madman that goes into her bathroom, and like she only has the tub for her to kind of hide in. So we have the woman who goes on and gets more and more tired. So she then is to fall over, and the madman is to get on top of her and is to start to peel away at her hairline and is to kind of scalp her. So we have Colette, who is now dead. And so we go on to have Virginia, that is to have read this part of the story. And so the very next day, we go on, and I think Virginia goes to her job and is, I think at this point, she ends up asking where Mona was to have gone on and got the copy of I, Madman. Because Virginia, when she goes on to get her groceries and comes back home after her theater class, she sees the I, Madman book by her door, and she picks it up and she starts reading it. And she immediately assumes that Mona did it, and Mona's like, well, I didn't find that book. So Virginia's like, well, who else could have known about the book? And she's like, well, it must just be a weird, goofy coincidence. So Virginia just kind of lets it weirdly slide. So we after Virginia is done with her work day, she goes and looks at this newspaper to notice that the actress Colette is now dead. And so Virginia's like, oh my god, like, this is so weird. So Virginia kind of reads about the case and finds out about it, and Virginia is to realize, is like, wow, like, this seems so similar to the story of which that I had just read. This seems so weird. So we have at one point where Virginia is to pick up I, Madman again and start reading it. And so she goes onto this bus, and then all of a sudden the madman is to touch Virginia on the shoulder and is to say, see anything you like. And he is now wearing the red wig that, of course, Colette had been wearing earlier. So all of a sudden Virginia is now freaked out about that, and the bus driver is saying, like, hey, like, ma'am, are you ready to get on the bus? And Virginia goes on the bus and realizes that the madman is now gone. He's disappeared. So Virginia is to be more and more freaked out about this, but that doesn't stop her from wanting to go on and continue to read this book. because she's just still intrigued by it. So Virginia goes on to be tempted to read the book again, but she closes it and thinks that she can go on and no longer read the book anymore. So Virginia is to hope now that this all can stop, but then we have the Madman who appears at Virginia's place and is to notice that Virginia is to listen to the piano uh, repair and restore guy. So the Madman then goes off and is to find this guy and kill him. Virginia tries to call the police to report this crime, to report this death, and so the police ends up going to this location, finding out that this guy is dead. Richard is to open up this blind and is to realize that Virginia is looking on. And so Richard is to go to Virginia's place and is to ask, like, hey, did you see this guy die? And Virginia's like, of course I did. And so Richard is like, well, good, then you can be like the eyewitness and you can tell us what he looked like. So Richard takes Virginia to the uh, guys who can go on and give a sketch of what this guy could possibly look like. So Virginia starts to describe this guy, but then all of a sudden she then divulges that this guy was to be in her story, was to be in her book, and now like he's coming to life. And so now we have Richard's boss that's just like, yeah, I can't buy this. Like, this girl is a loon. No. Like, there's no way I can go on and hear this girl out. So, we have, of course, Richard's boss who's telling Richard, hey, I need a moment to talk to you. So, and we have Sergeant Navarro, who is to be Richard's partner, who's just like, well, hey, like the boss is wanting you to talk, and Richard's like, yeah, give me a minute. So Richard and Virginia are talking, and so Virginia is telling Richard, it's like, well, like, you need to go on and read this book because maybe a lot of this stuff is going to be similar. And maybe this will help you out in your investigation, and so on and so forth. And Richard is like, I don't know, like this, like, no. So Richard goes on and it's to just go to his boss and have his boss kind of chew him out. So it seems that Virginia is to go on to continue to figure out what is going on in the next part of the book. So Virginia is to leave Richard a note stating that the next kill will happen soon. And so when Richard is going on and talking to his boss, we of course have Virginia that is to figure out where the next kill is going to be happening, and she ends up witnessing the Madman go on and kill Lenny, Virginia's friend, because we go on to not only have Virginia that after she is to kind of sit by this precinct, we have the Madman that goes on and appears in Virginia's elevator to scare her, and Virginia's just saying, just kill me already, just do it. And the madman won't, he'll just kind of walk away. And so Virginia just kind of waits by the precinct uh, for Richard, and so she just continues to wait. And so Virginia ends up going to this bench, still waiting to get picked up. And so Lenny ends up kind of being there and is to like, well, hey, like, you want to share a pizza? So Lenny ends up kind of walking off, realizing that he's going to probably just have Virginia be there for a while, waiting for this person. So Lenny goes off to get this pizza, and instead he ends up getting a slice of his face being removed, which of course is to be his nose. So Virginia is to realize that Lenny is to get followed by this madman, and he, of course, is to have lost his nose. So we then have Virginia that is to really just tell Richard, it's like, well, hey, I told you so. Like, I knew this was going to happen, and you did nothing to prevent any of this. So we have Richard that is to go on and just be like, well, yeah, I guess you caught me there. Like, it seems that Virginia is to always be like a step ahead of the police. So Richard goes on and at some point finally reads this book, and Richard is to say, it's like, well, yeah, like, it seems that there's a lot of similarities to this book. And so we even go on to have Virginia that is to even go to look at this book and realize that the book is nonfiction. So Virginia goes on to the publisher, who, of course, was to be Zeit Z Publishing. ZEIT. So we go on to have Virginia, who goes on and speaks with this publisher, and weirdly enough, I think IMDb calls him like Sidney Zeit, but like, I think he goes on and he states that he is to be some other name. I think he ends up stating, but anyways, so Virginia ends up going on to talk to this guy who had published uh, Malcolm Brand's books. And so normally this guy would publish adult books, but he went on and just published this guy's books anyways. So Virginia is to ask about the history of this guy who went on and did these books. And so the publisher ends up stating that after the second book, it seems that this guy was to refuse to kind of continue on to finish up the second book, because it seems that oddly the book was talking to him, and that everything that was inside the book just became real. And so it seems that the guy would go on and was to have gone to a mental hospital, or at some point been into a padded room because he had just gone crazy. So Virginia is to go on and be like, okay, like, so, like, after even like the author was to have gone on and was to have like horrible things happen to him, like, what's going to eventually just happen to Virginia the longer and longer that she ends up kind of figuring out this whole story. So Virginia then goes on to continue to read every bit of the story, even the ending, so that way she can kind of quickly bash through it, so she can figure out what happens to what could possibly be her own character, who is Anna. And so Virginia is to find out that it seems that the killer ends up carving out this woman's heart and wears it around like a necklace or like a crucifix. So Virginia is kind of waiting for how that is going to play out in real life now that there seems to be uh, like a story that has to kind of play out here. But the next thing that has to supposedly play out is that a librarian is to go on and get attacked. And so we have Virginia telling Richard about the next part of the story. And so Richard is like, okay, like, it seems like the only librarian or the library that only makes sense is that there are to be like these lions that are to be in front of this library. So let's go on and do this kind of like stakeout kind of thing and have like this librarian who goes on and closes this library, and we'll kind of stake it out. So it seems that the librarian, when they end up kind of setting her up, all of a sudden she passes out. And so Virginia ends up switching clothes with this girl. And so Virginia goes on to close this library. And so she is wearing this like wire where she can talk to these police officers. So at one point she is hearing somebody moving around in the library. And so she's stating like, okay, he's getting closer, he's in the room. So Richard and all of the detectives go on and rush out and come to find out the guy that comes into the room is just the janitor who does some late night cleaning. So it's just a normal thing. So they go on and they're just like, like, all right, well, like, yeah, like we got kind of a cob with egg on our face and whatever, like we're gonna look bad. So come to find out, we have Virginia who actually just figures it out of what a library is meant for the Madman to go after and attack because it has more of a connection to Virginia. So Richard, of course, is talking to his boss, probably getting fired or probably getting suspended or whatever without pay. Who knows? Or really just kind of getting a stern talking to, just like, hey man, like, you're making me look bad. So Virginia goes on to give a note to one of the detectives stating that the actual library that's supposed to mean in the book is that it's actually going to be the used bookstore. Richard was even stating how like he doesn't know if they can go on and really figure out what the cryptic thing of all of this means, and so they may not be able to decipher what the outcome of this book is to really be in real life. So but it seems that Virginia can because she can kind of make the connection to a library and what could like actually fit her in this story. So Virginia goes to the used bookstore and she goes into this place and is to try to figure out if Mona is still alive. Come to find out, when Virginia is to make her way into this used bookstore, she finds out that Mona is dead and is to have lost quite a bit of her mouth. So that way it tells us that uh, the Madman is to replace his whole entire face now. And so now we go on to have Virginia, who is desperately trying to call for the police, hoping that also Richard will have gotten the message that Virginia is to have left him. So we have Virginia that is realizing that the Madman is in this used bookstore. So Virginia is desperately trying to crazily climb up these stairs to make it to the upstairs part of this used bookstore, and she ends up having all these books kind of fall around her, and so that then has Virginia try to struggle to get up these stairs. So Virginia does get up to the stairs, and so the madman is kind of slowly but surely behind her. So we go on to have the madman state that he's going to go on and he's going to use this razor and he's going to like cut her. And so by the time that the madman goes on and tries to do that, we have it by the time that he tries to swing, we have Richard that comes in and starts shooting into, of course, the madman, having him fall over. So Richard then runs to try to get up this staircase. So Virginia grabs Richard, and Richard grabs Virginia, and they're trying to comfort one another. But it seems that the madman gets back up. So the madman is starting to like wrestle with Richard, and we have Richard who ends up getting his hand cut. So we have Virginia that goes through and is to reread the very first book that she is to read, called uh oh my god, uh Much Madness, More Sin. uh sure. So she rereads the book about the dog and is to talk about how the dog is alive. It's alive. So the dog baby thing ends up reappearing again, the monstrous thing, to then try to fight off the madman. So we have this monster being on like the good side of things, and so we have at one point where the madman goes on to toss this thing through this window and it ends up cutting the monster in half. But the monster still goes on and is to limp on to go after the madman and is to figure out a way to kill the both of them off. So by the end of this, it seems that this, of course, is to finally get resolved without either Virginia or Richard losing their lives or die here. And so we go on and have like the that story kind of end. And so here's the thing, it feels that like the Madman story is probably like the first story where the first book that Virginia reads is actually like should reasonably be the second story, but I guess she just kind of read them out of um out of place. So with that said, hopefully I was to cover most of the parts in this movie. I know there's a lot of bits and pieces, but either way, I think I'm just gonna go on and just try to get out of here so I can go on and just put this one out. Hopefully people are gonna go and check out this movie, but then again, it might just not be for you. Uh, I apologize also. There was probably not a lot of times where I was to do the perfect dialogue and whatever, but I think I got the gist of most of the movie. There's some certain parts of the dialogue where I'm like, I don't remember where this is. Plus, it's getting later than normal for me to go on and do reviews, so I kind of get a little foggy about what all happens. And there's some certain points in time where I'm thinking, oh yeah, I can think of the dialogue, and then all of a sudden I'm like, I don't remember. But anyways, with that, there's just a lot of stuff that happens in this film, and there's a lot of times where I feel like it kind of does the same thing over and over again. Especially with Richard continuously having to go on and talk to his boss. So like that really to me gets very effed up for me. I don't remember what happens like through a good portion of that because it's all the same thing over and over and over again. Um, but either way, anyways, I'm just gonna just apologize for that. But either way, see the movie, watch it. You can know the order of which that everything plays out. So without a doubt, bye everybody. Bye everybody.